Bristol Community College, Mathematics with Dan Avedikian, Math 131, Elements of College Mathematics, Section 2.2, Problem 35. This is Section 2.2, Problem 35. It says solve the matrix. We have a matrix with a top row of -1, 1, 0, -3. The middle row is 0, 1, -1, +1. And the bottom row is 1, 0, 1, 4. So to solve a matrix of this size, what you want to do, the very first step is step 1, get a 1 in the upper leftmost position. So we have a -1. So this one, it is pretty feasible to multiply the top row through by 1 over -1, which would essentially just flip the signs of everything. So there'd be a +1, -1, 0 just stays 0, and the 3 would become +3. No fractions, and that would work. Or you could swap row 1 with row 3, and I'd get a 1 that would show up where I need it. In this case, it's really about the same amount of work. You'd get the same answer either way. I guess I'll go with the row swap, but the times -1 would work just as well, same answer. So I'll set up my next matrix. And off to the side, I am going to write swap row 1, comma, row 3. I want row 3 because I want this one to come up here. So the top row will now be 1, 0, 1, 4. The middle row can stay the middle row. That's fine where it is, 0, 1, -1, +1. And what was row 1 is going to go down to row 3. So -1, +1, 0, -3. And again, I had a different option that would also work well enough. I chose to swap the rows. Again, I'm going to get the same answer in the end either way. Now, step 1 is complete. I have a 1 in the upper left. Step 2, I want to make zeros under that 1 in the leftmost column. One value already is 0, which is nice. So the only thing I really need to worry about is zeroing out the -1 in the bottom row. So let me set up my next matrix. And as I set up the next one, the top row is good the way it is. It has a 1 where I need it. I don't want that to change. So the top row will stay 1, 0, 1, 4. And in fact, usually I'd have to make an equation and do some work to turn the number in this position here where I'm pointing into a 0. It already is a 0 in the second row, so that can stay. So the second row just stays as is, 0, 1, -1, 1. And the bottom row, I need to make a 0 where I currently have a -1. So I'm going to make an equation to make that happen. My equation will begin with row 3 because that's the row making the 0 in row 3. And the equation will be row 3 equals some stuff plus the old row 3. Whatever row my equation begins with, it must end in the same row. If it begins in row 3, it will end in row 3. And what I initially just call stuff and leave a blank spot for, the stuff is the row with the 1 in the same column, which is row 1. And it'll be multiplied times the number I'm zeroing out, but with the opposite sign. So I'm zeroing a -1. So in my equation, I use a +1. My equation is the new row 3 equals 1 times row 1 plus the old row 3. So essentially, it's row 1 plus row 3. The times 1 doesn't change anything, really. So in the first column, row 1 plus row 3 is 1 plus -1, 0. The next column, row 1 plus row 3 is 0 plus 1. That's 1. The next column, row 1 plus row 3 is 1 plus 0, 1. The last column, row 1 plus row 3 is 4 plus -3. That'll be +1. So the first column is done. Got the 1 where it needs to be, zeroed out the other value that I had there, so step 2 is complete. Step 3 is get a 1 in this middle position here, which by coincidence already is a 1. Again, we get that step for free. So the next step, what I'm going to do is step 4, which is zero out the other values in that second column. Well, in the top row, I already have a 0. But in the bottom, I have +1. I'll make an equation that will make that turn into a 0, and that'll complete the second column. So as I set up my next matrix, row 1, again, by coincidence, is all set to go. Ordinarily, I have to make an equation to make that value at the top of the second column turn into a 0. It just wound up being a 0 by itself. So I get to keep row 1 the way it is. 1, 0, 1, 4. That's good. Row 2, again, I don't want to change that. I want a 1 in the second column, and I've got it. 0, 1, -1, +1. Row 3 must change, so I'm going to make an equation to make the change. So my equation begins with row 3 because that's the row where I want the 0 to show up in row 3. The equation will equal some stuff plus the old row 3, because if my equation begins in row 3, it must end in row 3. And again, what I initially just referred to as stuff is the row with the 1, which is row 2. Actually, I made a mistake. I put row 1 is row 2. That's the row with the 1, plus row 3. And I have to multiply row 2 times the number I'm zeroing, but with the opposite sign. So I'm zeroing a positive 1, so in my equation I have a negative 1. So my equation is row 3 equals negative 1 times row 2 plus row 3. So do that equation right through. See what changes. The first column won't change. Negative 1 times row 2 is negative 1 times 0, which is 0 plus row 3. 0 plus 0, 0. Excellent. Next, row 1, negative 1 times row 2 is negative 1 times 1. That's going to make a negative 1. Add to row 3, negative 1, positive 1. Negative 1, positive 1, 0. Next, negative 1 times row 2 is a negative 1 times a negative 1. The negatives will cancel. You'll have a positive 1. Add that result to row 3, positive 1 and another positive 1, positive 2. And finally, the last position, negative 1 times row 2 is negative 1 times 1. Make a minus 1. Add to row 3. So negative 1 and positive 1 is 0. OK. So step 4 is complete. The other values in the second column have become zeros. On to step 5. The 2 in the bottom row, third column over, must become a 1. Now notice there's a 1 that lines up, but I can't swap those rows, because if I swap those rows, I will undo some of my work in the first column, which I don't want to do. So I have to multiply the third row by 1 over the value that must become a 1, in this case 1 over 2. Now because of the other zeros, I'm not going to really have to deal with any fractions. They'll just zero out and it'll be OK. So I'm going to set up the next matrix. And again, in the next one, the top row can stay as is. 1, 0, 1, 4. The middle row for now can stay the way it is. 0, 1, negative 1, positive 1. And the bottom row, I'm going to make a new row 3, which is 1 over 2 times the old row 3. So again, when I make zeros, I'm adding rows together. When I make ones, it's just a fraction times that row, if I can't swap. And in this case, I can't swap. 1 over the number that's turning into a 1. Notice same sign, positive 2, positive 2. So 1 over positive 2 times 0, anything times 0 is 0. Zeros are great to multiply times. Same thing in the next position. 1 over 2 times 0, 0. Next one, 1 over 2 times 2. When I multiply, I'll make 2 over 2. And the 2's cancel. 2 over 2 reduces to 1. And in the last position, 1 over 2 times 0 again. Because this times 0 just zeroes out. So I got the 1 in the bottom corner, which is what I need to get. And step 6, the last step, is anything else in that third column has to get zeroed out. So the positive 1 in the top and the negative 1 in the middle row. So set up what will be the final matrix. So in row 1, I'm going to zero out a 1. So my equation will begin with row 1, because that's the row I'm making the 0. And that will equal some stuff plus the old row 1. If my equation begins in row 1, it must end in row 1. Now, what I initially call stuff is the row with the 1 in the same column, which is row 3, times the number I'm zeroing, but opposite sign. So I'm zeroing a positive 1, so I multiply times negative 1. So my equation is row 1, the new row 1 equals negative 1 times row 3 plus the old row 1. So negative 1 times row 3 is negative 1 times 0. Add that to row 1. So 0 plus 1 is 1. Next column, negative 1 times row 3 is negative 1 times 0. So that makes a 0. Add to row 1. 0 plus 0 is 0. Next position, negative 1 times row 3 is negative 1 times positive 1. That makes a minus 1. Add to row 1. Negative 1 and positive 1. Negative 1 plus positive 1 is 0. And in the last column, negative 1 times row 3 is negative 1 times 0. 0. Add that result to row 1, so 0 plus 4 is 4. So there's one of my zeros. So next, in the third column, that minus 1 in the middle row has to become a 0. So I'm going to make an equation for that. So I'm working in row 2, so my equation begins in row 2. It must begin with the row where I want to make the 0, row 2. That will equal some stuff plus the old row 2. If it begins in row 2, it ends in row 2. The stuff is the row where the 1, the row with the 1 in the same column, which is row 3. And that row, row 3, gets multiplied times the number I'm zeroing, but opposite signs. So I'm zeroing a minus 1. So in my equation, I have positive 1. Both 1, one's negative, one's positive. So my equation is the new row 2 equals 1 times row 3 plus the old row 2. And again, the 1 times row 3, I'm really just doing row 3 plus row 2. The times 1, I can just call it row 3. So right across, row 3 plus row 2. First column, 0 plus 0 is 0. Next column, row 3 plus row 2. 0 plus 1 is 1. Next column, row 3 plus row 2. Positive 1, negative 1. Add them together, you get 0. Last column, row 3 plus row 2. 0 plus 1. 0 plus 1 is 1. Bottom row is good the way it is. 0, 0, 1, 0. And now I have all the ones and zeros where they're supposed to show up. So my final solution, the top row says that x is 4. The middle row says y is 1. And the bottom row says z is 0. And that's the solution.